Geraldine Doogue has established herself as one of the most respected and popular personalities on national television and radio. I think the attendance here tonight bears that out very strongly. Geraldine, whilst originally planning a career as a school teacher after completing her arts degree, in 1972 applied on an impulse for a journalism cadetship with the West Australian newspaper. Since then, however, Geraldine has worked on commercial radio and television and has spent most of her career working with the ABC. In 1992, Geraldine began presenting Life Matters, a new ABC radio national program which set out to cover the full gamut of social issues in everyday life. In 1998, she also became host of the ABC TV's Compass program, which looks at issues of spirituality, philosophy and belief every Sunday evening. I'm sure many of you watch that. After 11 years with Life Matters, she moved to Saturday mornings to host a program focusing on international politics, Australia's role on the world stage and business. The program's called Saturday Extra on Radio National. Tonight, I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing from Geraldine Doogue. Her topic is Only Connect, the Catholic Church's Key Challenge in Australia. Please welcome Geraldine again.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much indeed, Bill, and thank you for coming out on a cool night, although I was rugged up as if it was the Russian steppes, and it's actually not that bad, I find. It's a particular Sydney prejudice. Now, in fact, I'm a bit indebted, really, to St Teresa of Avila, because she said this first. At the outset of her classic work, The Way of Perfection, she confesses, "Since I don't know what I am to say, I cannot say it in an orderly way." And I have struggled, I have to confess, to say something constructive and honest. And so when Bill finally said, after months of prompting, we need a title and then we need a summary and we need it now, I sort of fell back on this wondrous little nugget of the novelist E.M. Forster, Only Connect, from Howard's End. Because the more I considered things, the more my conviction firmed up, really, that connecting within this complex community of ours is the mission at hand, that a real opportunity is staring the church in the face at the moment, and it's quite a countercultural opportunity of considerable import, I'd suggest to you. That is the challenge to rebut the great impersonal tendency in our midst. If you take away any words, that's what I want you to take away. The impersonal tendency, I think, that's what I've decided almost describes what I'm trying to get at, and in a way to model what it means to be truly personal in our dealings with the world and each other, laity to clergy, clergy to laity, to religious, a real personability. I'm not sure that I know about St Thomas More talking about personability. He was, it seems to me, interested in a lot of things, a lot to do with power. This is not about power, but it's something much more humble. I accept that. Doesn't have that soaring invitation that a lot of the great injunctions to us are. See me and all my little ones and so on, all those marvellous invitations we know so well. But you know, sometimes I do wonder whether in trying to answer the big option for the poor question, which we Catholics are invited to do, and I admire that, we can avert our gaze from another poverty, the poverty of meaningful everyday connections between maybe quite materially prosperous people, those with whom we deal constantly in our working and community life. I sense that maybe many of us, I certainly include myself, have fallen into the trap of stripping down our interpersonal contacts and deciding that friendliness and grace can be sidelined without much downside. that in the noisy hurly-burly of trying to keep on the right path and lead a reasonable life, that we might be overlooking these building blocks and consigning them to some past, a quieter, gentler time. Now, my thoughts are still forming on this, but they have been genuinely churning around for a while now. And they're all part of trying to imagine a better applied theology for a time of plenty. This is what we're living through, and I know not everybody is going through plenty, I know that, but I'm sometimes a bit struck by how we don't talk about the challenges of plenty, which is surely the burden and the joy of what Australia is living through. And I feel there are tremendous rewards, and I'm thrilled that many Australians have done so well out of this time, but many other risks exist too, and they have been vividly revealed in this latest National Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing in Australia. And my sense is, when I give you some of these statistics, you can draw your own conclusions, but I have little doubt that a question of personal belonging, this confidence in a personal belonging within a wider predictable community, that sense of confidence has shrunk in this last generation. And I think the church is both part of the solution and the problem. Now, the survey was reported in the latest psychiatry industry journal, and it was given a thorough airing on Norman Swan's health report back on July the 13th on Radio National, if you care to seek it out. The information was collected 2 years ago, 10 years after an earlier version. There were 9,000 people, that's a very big survey, door-knocked, all states and territories. 40% of the houses approached didn't care to be involved, just to be accurate, but I think it is really worth listening to the results because of the numbers involved and the open nature of the very skilled questioning, you know, all balanced by international tests and so on and so forth. Overall, it found an astounding 1 in 2 of us will have a diagnosable problem with anxiety, depression or drug and alcohol abuse in our lifetimes. A pretty high proportion had had problems within the previous 12 months, and a big percentage don't even seek out help. Now, lest you think these researchers sort of rolled up and said, we're from the government and we're here to help, and do you have a depression or an anxiety or an alcohol abuse? It wasn't quite as blunt as that. They were very skilled in their questioning. They did try to seek out well-being, which made me in fact trust the results a lot more. And they asked about people's participation, their engagement in school or employment, what they felt able to do in any general week in their lives, their support networks, a lot of information about areas of functioning, as well as areas, symptoms of mental disorder. And there was a strong finding related to comorbidity. So get used to hearing, this was a very interesting new understanding. That is, people regularly suffered more than one condition simultaneously, depression, say, and alcohol abuse, or anxiety and social phobia. And I mean, it makes sense, but it hadn't actually been described so vividly before. What really intrigued me, and the researchers I might add, was the finding that in this comorbid group, out of their last 30 days, 9 were so full of difficulties that the people felt unable to undertake normal activities. 4 out of the previous 30, people were feeling quite acutely bad. 1 in 8 had considered suicide. 4% had actually prepared a plan. So that's a lot of days lost, and that's a lot of demoralisation. And there was a particular doctor, Dr. Mari Thiessen, said they're probably not caring for their kids properly, they're probably not going to work, they're probably not able to do whatever it is they would normally do. So there's no way these people aren't suffering. But a lot of them, because of the stigma of mental health, still, they didn't even sense they had a problem. They certainly didn't feel, they thought it was just their lot, which is a small tragedy, I think. Now, what do I want the church to take out of this type of complex, very recent and relevant research? Well, you know, above all, I wanted to be humbled by figures like this. I wanted to acknowledge that it may be falling short in delivering a sufficient glimpse of the great consolation on offer from our Christian tradition that would allay some of this sense of suffering. I also think I'd like the church to be humbled by the notion that it clearly hasn't delivered a sense of the sacred to enough people. Come to me, all ye who labour and are overburdened, and I will give you rest. It's not easy to absolutely test this, but I do sincerely believe that better equipped Australians carrying a better ballast of consolation and a sense of the sacred will sally forth more durably into this world of fast change. Much better armoured, much more robust than those without it. And of course it means that all of us who consider ourselves pilgrims of the church, inheritors of our tradition, must ask ourselves, am I being of sufficient service inside and outside our parishes? And I think it's really quite a solemn question. And I think it does matter how you ask that question. And this is where I think we can often be led by really, really good researchers, and whether you listen to the answers. Often people barely whisper these answers. They've lost confidence in the role that they play in life. That's another one of the clear implications offered by this research. Two key insights have hit me during my many years of interviewing. The first is the way help is offered by people, and this can come from within the church, and maybe we've all done it. Help is offered by people to people, others, whom they consider in need, and often given in very well-meaning ways, but just not where it's really needed. And I've seen this myself with people often suffering the tragedy of separation and divorce, who look on wistfully at people given a great deal of help if there's a death, for instance, in the family, when in fact there's been a small death in their lives. And I mean, I'm sure we can all offer a range of thoughts, but I really think it's about watching where people are and delivering it where we may not wish to deliver it. And the second thing is this incredible importance of dignity at times like this, of taking people seriously enough to draw them into your dilemmas, of deciding that they're worth disagreeing with. A marvellous Vietnamese woman said this to me years ago on Life Matters. She was a very elegant, a very impressive woman who'd come out here as a boat person. And she gave me this powerfully eloquent message that what she'd loathed when she first arrived here was that she knew she was being ignored. People weren't even seeing her when they were seeing her. And she said, I knew it meant you don't matter. It was worse than any racism, she said. Far worse. Anything crude like somebody saying something against Vietnamese. It was the ultimate in impersonal conduct. And I never forgot this. And I have tested it in terms of that capacity to sort of almost say to somebody, I'm not going to take you for granted. So, first of all, I would like the church to consider seeking the views of parishioners throughout Australia in a properly conducted survey and asking them what they determine to be the main challenges to their sense of flourishing in their journey of life. Because for me, that is the yield from my faith, a sense of flourishing on a journey. And they're not givens in our modern world. Neither of those concepts are givens. And I think it really is a precious yield from belonging to something that draws you in and asks you to grow. Years ago, I read one of those little pamphlets that was on the seat in my church, the Redemptorists. It was back in Perth, actually, and the Redemptorists used to hand it out. It was a Father William Stimson. Some of you may have come across him. And he wrote very well, and he talked then about being accompanied by a faith of possibilities through life. And his point was it wasn't just a faith of no's or don'ts, it was a faith of possibilities. And it had an extraordinary effect on a young woman, a bit of a hopeful young woman, but a bit of a timid woman too, with much to come. And in a way, I think it's been the invitation of my life, that little phrase, you can choose to have a faith of possibilities accompany you. It's really fortified me through many, many ups and downs. And oddly enough, I suppose in a way, I've come to terms with how it's altered this faith of possibilities. I have less, to be perfectly honest, a less vivid sense of a personal friendship with God than I used to have in my younger days, but somehow a more developed commitment to my faith amidst a more of a serenity than I ever thought possible from time to time in my life, suggesting that I must be roughly on the right track in terms of accepting that invitation about believing that it was worth taking part in this faith of possibilities. And my spiritual search is far from over. I fully recognise that. In other words, I expect still to be battered around very much. I'm not talking about any sense of being taken out like a Teflon-coated person out of all the hurly-burly and the bustle of life. I expect all manner of shocks. Just when I think that I'm in some reasonable battle over here, the actual shock will come from over here. But I don't feel in danger of the abyss. That's the point, of something swallowing up or opening up and swallowing me, which is what I suspect a lot of those people who were mentioned in the mental health survey do feel. And it's where, one way and the other, I think the challenge lies to the church and to us. Now, of course, I have this real sense of control in many ways over my life. You know, I'm a presenter on the ABC. People work with me and to me, and in many ways I can say what I choose to do. And that is a real privilege, not available to many, many people. I would like to know if the church even understands some of the yearnings and the sense of loss of control in their parishioners' lives. I would like the church to be more confident, because I don't think the church is for a second, and I think that's part of what goes on. There's a sort of recognised, self-identified insecurity in many people in the church at the moment about whether they do know what their parishioners' dreams are, and hopes, and sorrows and sadnesses. And if they asked, yes, they may hear some torrents of abuse about the church, though I'm sure personally that could be coped with. But if asked deftly, I think people really might find the words that attach to their feelings and give the most vital information back to church authorities about the things that contribute to those mental health statistics that really are a terrible blight on Australian life and a real loss of talent. And I think these are some of the things people might say. I think people might describe the challenge of changing and adapting to a sense of constant change, where developments never seem to slow, where you never feel you can perfect anything much, where good and bad exist side by side, and you find yourself, in a way, trying to discern what's durable. And it's hard, and you often feel on your own doing that. I think people might talk about being overwhelmed by information, and that trying to pick and choose what really mattered for them and their children, and what might offer insight and the real glittering prize, wisdom, that is wearing them down. And that just keeping up is that sense of, is it worth it? And yet you know that to not keep up, there's not much in that either. I think they might talk about the fact that shopping isn't proving ultimately satisfying, which is certainly wooed me over the years. Yet all the latest psychological research, sometimes dubbed this happiness research, about modern Western predicaments consistently show this catch-22. That the trouble is we adapt so fast to all this increased affluence and the things it brings, like the big telly sets and the U-Butte iPods and so on. We adapt. We take them for granted. That's what makes it so hard for governments. And we sort of desire up. We just set ourselves new horizons and new goals of aspirations. My 15-year-old son said, "Mum, it's just a condition of being human, that we're perpetually discontented." But we don't adapt to everything quite like this. This same research shows that events, festivals, rituals, convivial occasions, hobbies, passions, things that can't be bought, things that can't necessarily be repeated. You know that sense, I missed that. That was something not to miss. These are the characteristics, these are the things, dare I say, that confer on us a real sense of satisfaction, because they're the great bonus, because we don't adapt to them effortlessly. So it's that counterintuitive thing. These parishioners might talk about loss, a pervasive sense that they feel they've lost the capacity to control events. Look, I'm not sure we ever did have the capacity to control events, but there's a really strong sense, it's coming through all the research, that people feel they've got even less capacity to control the course of events. But this is tricky too, because the American writer Andrew O'Keefe has a good take on this. People are not hardwired, he said, to resist change, because that's something that is often said. People are fine with change, provided it meets one criterion, that it doesn't involve loss. We're hardwired for loss aversion. And people have confidence before realism. We're hardwired to emphasise what is possible and to underemphasise what is practical. That is, big on aspiration and lower on implementation, which I thought was very true of me. People might also nominate mixed feelings about aloneness and loneliness. And it might even confuse them, this, because the fact is ever greater numbers of people are choosing to live alone. I think it's up to almost 40% of dwellings. So we have to accept that this is clearly chosen. And yet, you might have also heard that research from Professor Adrian Franklin from the University of Tasmania recently about the pervasiveness of consciously acknowledged loneliness among Australians from 25 to 44, not the usual candidates at all, people perceived to be in the prime of interactivity. And they were quite acutely aware that their connections were not necessarily durable, that they couldn't rely on them, and it made them quite edgy. And they might say, if asked, how impersonal many of their interactions are. I'm talking about the parishioners. But I think this is tricky. This impersonal word, I think, is I think it's worth wrestling with. Because, look, we do need hierarchies of relationships in our lives. We can't, beyond basic respect and a gift of kindness if necessary, we can't whip ourselves into a lather over falling into a natural reserve with people who just casually cross our paths every day of the week. We're not required, I don't think, but maybe this could be a debating point, we're not required to display the same kind of commitment to casual encounters as we are to intimates. In fact, it might even, it seems to me, engender a bogus notion of relationship. So I think the thing to guard against, and what I'm trying to get at with this question of impersonal nature of things, is a callousness or an indifference. And I think these can really creep up on us. I really do. And particularly, oddly enough, in a service-orientated culture. I think it's a real It's a real underbelly. I mean, humans are not supposed to be widgets that are summoned up in a just-in-time mentality. I think if we get locked into repetitive display behaviour, we risk tumbling into this impersonal trap. And you can both neglect and miss the big one, the truly personal relations on offer. I read a marvellous little book recently called On Kindness, which I commend to you, by Adam Phillips and Barbara Taylor. And it's a history of kindness down through the ages, and made the point that until about the 16th century, the word Christian caritas functioned as a crucial glue, really, within community, and it was well understood. It was sort of a binder. Love thy neighbour as thyself. And then with the rise of competitive individualism, actually kindness became to be a bit suspect. And their thesis is that it's got to the point in the 21st century people say kindness is for losers, which is a sort of a complete tragedy. Whereas this is what they say about kindness. Kindness is an experience that we have been unable to give up on. The unromantic kindness, which encourages a feeling of aliveness as compatible with, indeed integral to, a feeling of vulnerability, creating the kind of intimacy and involvement with other people that we both fear and crave. That is, kindness fundamentally makes life seem worth living, and that everything that is against kindness is an assault on our hope. It's a beautiful summary. So, coming back to the church, how do I want them to tackle this? Well, as I say, if they'd done if they were curious enough to ask the questions properly, and I don't think they have, I think they could then start to offer something back, which I think people are yearning for. And a sort of checklist for the soul, I would say. I think language is quite important here, and I think that this would be far more than what's offered by self-help and by a lot of the psychological writings and literature at the moment. Though I would like to warn the church that a lot of those outlets are very good these days, and they've stepped into the vacuum, and the church has got to step up. The church hasn't got it to itself. I mean, that's blindingly obvious, but there's some very, very good quality consolation now offered to people. I just know how much more the church could be doing. Broadly speaking, I would imagine these are the sorts of sort of almost like a modern examination of conscience, but that's probably old words. As I said, I thought checklist for the soul was better, but this is what could be offered. What are the false gods in your life? I mean, nobody uses words like that, but I've always found if ever you do, it rings a bell. People understand what you're getting at, and it invites a different review of yourself. What are your hopes and aspirations for yourself long term, not short term? And this is where I think it's really countercultural, because the idiom of the moment is all short term. But the church can offer and guide a long term reflection, which I think would be terrific. Where are the durable connections in your life? This is what Archbishop Nichols was getting at actually in the UK recently when he talked about kids and sort of fast-moving connections, virtual connections. And in the great odyssey that is your own life, what sort of pilgrim do you determine yourself to be? Again, language that invites a different form of introspection. What type of pilgrim do you want to be? Do you reflect on the depth of things, such a marvellous fruit of our tradition, that there's always more underway than is obvious, and so there is with you? Do you identify losses and gains? Because only then can you start to explore a spirit of gratitude that many holy people throughout the centuries have identified as key to spiritual growth and possibly the counter to perpetual discontent. And maybe just this little short meditation offered to me at a quick retreat some years back by the late Father Jerry Coleman, whom some of you may have known, and I think deserves wider circulation. It certainly fortified me for years. At the end of each week or month or whatever it is, ask yourself these two questions. Have I lived by gospel values this week? and what has been truly life-enhancing this week. And I can assure you that the impersonal won't come in there as a tick. I suggest to you that it's a corrective. Look, years ago I heard a lovely definition, probably actually Thomas More would have approved of this, again deceptively modest for ordinary souls, not saints. Sanctity is merely the doing of one's allotted task in life to the best of one's ability. And I heard that when I was about 15, sitting in the pews where a very flawed priest was struggling with his priesthood and ultimately left it actually. But I always thought it was a fantastic description. Sanctity is merely the doing of one's allotted task in life to the best of one's ability. It's not utopian, it's fundamentally practical, and I think it's a real companion to life. And I think that it does stand side by side with the other gem that I've chosen to use tonight to prompt some thought. Only connect. Thank you.
Is it not the task of each of us working together to respond to the challenge you offer?
Yes, look, you heard a certain confusion as I went in and out of that. I certainly believe we are the church. I've fundamentally taken that as my mantra, I suppose. But I will say this, that I have come to also be very respectful of the business of institutional organisation. And I suppose I know from volunteer groups I'm in that there's only so... People wear out, to be perfectly honest, after a certain length of time, and if there isn't paid help behind to think big and to think in a complex way, things don't happen. So I suppose of course you're right. If I care enough about this, I must seek to influence those who do have power over because I'm talking about little and big things. So I'm talking about change within ourselves and a desire to identify what is impersonal in our lives, because I think it's insidious. But I'm also talking about the church thinking about this as a real challenge, a real institutional challenge. So I am talking about two strands, and I think both areas have got to be hit.
Thank you, Geraldine. Michael Flynn from Downer asks, is ordination of women as priests in a church a factor in their connection to the faith community? Do you see differences on this issue in Anglicans and Catholics?
Very interesting question, because I can't personally see that that the calling to priesthood is fundamentally connected with connection. I mean, I see it as a development of the person, but I've talked about this to very good Anglican friends who I've noticed, and I sort of feel a little out of my depth here because I have a Catholic sensibility on this that is different from an Anglican sensibility, because I've often found Anglican women will say to me, one woman said, I know I have a calling to preach, she said. I want to preach. And I thought, I just don't understand that. And it's not something that is familiar to Catholics, that language. And this was put to Father Timothy Radcliffe recently, the Dominican who was here, and it was a quite delicate moment, actually, in the big forum that we had. And he said he'd want to ask somebody who had that degree of passion to analyse the passion, to work out what it was that was driving this sense of aspiration, which I thought was a very challenging answer. But I think it's a good answer, because I think that there's a humble acceptance of what one is asked to do that I think is also part of development of faith. And I've always found this, I have to admit, a tricky tension. So I won't satisfy a lot of you by that, but that is how I see it.
Thank you. Bill Phelan from Chisholm. Sometimes we ask people to name their organisation. Bill's representing the grumpy old men, Catholic teachers. And Bill asks, Geraldine, do you think it's time the Catholic Church provided a venue such as Hillsong to inspire our young people to come back to the church in a vibrant contemporary ambience with modern music and lively interaction? Don't we, the church, need to uplift rather than depress our people?
Yes, we do. Well, look, there's certainly something that needs to be done to draw young people back to feel that they're comfortable and that it matters sufficiently to them. And I don't for a moment have that answer. Look, this is really, I watch my own son, who is incredibly available for a style of preaching or service that is, I think, often quite hysterical. Like, I've just gone way past that need because I'm my age and he's his age, ready to, there's a tremendous hands-on sort of high-level engagement. I mean, he's a 15-year-old boy, so that seems to work very well with him, that would repel me, I have to admit. We have young people, we have once a month at our church, we have a particular choral group, and I'll be perfectly honest, I find their music quite challenging, but I see that it works. So it's got to be, again, that question of asking questions and listening to the responses, it seems to me. And there is some sort of disconnect underway. I feel that intellectually there's a lot that's working in the formation of our kids, actually, but it's in the ritual celebration, that somehow there doesn't seem to be, we're not tapping whatever it is needed in young people. And I'm afraid I mean, with Hillsong is a very interesting, they are providing, of course, incredible amounts of social work. We'll see whether there's quite a lot of evidence to say that people move through, the National Church Life Survey tends to show that people in their early years of marriage, child rearing and so on, there's a tremendous connection at Hillsong. And then when they have their first, possibly in their 40s, major setbacks in life, either love affairs, retrenchments, financial problems, it remains to be seen whether those evangelical churches and the outreach churches actually keep their people, because there's quite a churn factor at that very point. Now, I know they're working very hard on this right now, they've told me, but helping people when they stop being full of hope, which is really what I was also talking about, that's where the rubber hits the road, in my opinion.
Patrick, I'll read it again. Do you feel the church's problem lies in its clergy not being especially concerned that churchgoers necessarily know how best to relate to those around them? Yeah.
Well, I must say that I do think that my generation of Catholics and those beyond, there was a certain given that you turned up and that there was a certain amount that aggravated you, and that was almost part of it, and there was a certain amount that didn't. Well, I don't know, you weren't asked about what didn't, but I mean, there there was a lot that was taken for granted. There's no doubt about that. And I have seen quite a lot of that being overhauled, especially as psychology, I think, has been taken much more into clergy's understanding of their particular role in life. But somehow or other, I feel desperately sorry for a lot of the clergy in terms of how much they're asked to do these days. I just talk about role overload. And so that, and I know I've spoken to them, that whole question of the impersonal nature, that's exactly the word that they use about a lot of, especially these giant parishes and so on. So I suppose what I do think is that I think it would help if quite a few more clergy than I see yielded control of that responsibility for interaction within the parish, and really came to believe that they were sharing in a ministry and all that implied. And, this is the sort of thing that is happening throughout organisations. It's not as... I remember Paul Kelly, the Australian editor-at-large, came along with me to a bishops' conference a good 10 or 12 years ago, and he said something then. He said, this is when we were going through all manner of banks nearly falling over before, not recently, thank God, but this was when Westpac had nearly fallen over, as I said, way back in the 90s, and he said to the bishops, every one of our major institutions is overhauling itself and reinventing itself. The church will not escape. There wasn't much response from the bishops, but I remembered, I thought, I know they knew that was right, but, you look at recently in the ABC where there's a sort of great emphasis on this values identification, and we've come out with all of these values, and honestly I thought, oh, what a load of rubbish. I really was deeply sceptical. I went along with it, as we all compulsorily had to go along, but it's very interesting to see how it does work. The nomination, the wording that you put, and of course the wording had been consulted to death, and we all came out with all these different various bits and things. But it's been very surprising, I have to admit, to see how people are throwing around those words more and challenging others on them and so on and so forth. And I just think, so what I'm asking of clergy, say, in their own parishes, in redefining role, turning things upside down, devolving, all of that, there are loads of templates for that, I would argue. So I think it could be done, and I think that in fact it does lead to flourishing of individuals, including the priest.
Thank you. It seems the workload of priests and vocations is exercising the mind of at least three people here. Bill Coote of Campbell asks, do you think the sort of reorientation and reformulation you propose might lead young people to see the church as being more relevant? Bill says it's an awful word, sorry. And therefore, out of this would come more vocations.
Well, I certainly think that if modelling an emphasis on the personal and on relationship and on dignity and all those words I was using, I absolutely think that will show. I promise you it will. I think, and it might be subtle, but I think it would be immensely invigorating. And I know, don't get me wrong, I know that individually lots of people attempt to do that, but I mean much more stated, much more of a conscious sense that this is going to be a standing up within the forces around that seem to impinge on people. Now, in my experience of young people, that capacity to identify what the nature of some of the problems are and to have the nous to do so is immensely attractive. And so I can't say exactly how one thing flows into another, whether it inspires vocations in the way we've understood it. I'm not quite sure. I was just talking over here about the number of oblates, for instance, now, different forms of service attached to abbeys and so on, where people are coming in to combine their secular life, to almost ennoble the notion of spiritual growth within a lived secular life. Christian meditation, which I personally think is the way of the future, is making strides it didn't even dream of. So I think I really have come to believe this, that I wouldn't have when I was younger, that stated aims with nuanced mission statements, that's a very industrial term, but I think they do work. I think they do work. I think they can produce their own little bit of magic. And even against cynicism at the start, I think they work.
Maeve O'Collins from Campbell, who works with the ACU. Married priests, would this help resolve the gap between different levels in the church?
Yes, it would. Definitely. Well, I just cannot believe that with all the amount of effort that we've put in to training people, the church has put in, and then it just sidelines that. I just think it's gobsmacking. So yes, I'm afraid. I think that's one area that you won't get any debate from me on.
Monica Phelan of our parish asks, Geraldine, your message is visionary. How do you envision the church in a time of serious shortages of priests delivering a sense of the sacred to people?
Well, I mean, this is where obviously the laity has to be brought in and really asked to step up. Look, I think it's a tricky thing. I think the laity has got to step up, and the clergy's got to let them step up. And it's a dance between the two. I fully accept it's not. I've heard enough priests sort of say, or some priests really lament the lack of exuberance and enthusiasm. It's sort of very much a passing phase of commitment by lay people. But this is a new paradigm. And oddly enough, the more that is asked, I think, funnily enough, the more lay people will give. And the sorts of invitations to training courses that are like to various courses in theology, to new ways of being Catholic, if they are run well, they are all oversubscribed. Again and again you hear this. So I think there's an incredible desire to find a way to do this. However, this sense of the sacred, I mean, this is not just summoned up. If you notice, I didn't dwell too much on this because I'm very humble in the face of what is required in this sense. I mean, I feel that I simply grew up. I had a whole repertoire, a great repertoire given to me by the tribe in which I grew up. And in a sense, I have seen my job with my children as to continue to believe in that, but to see it as being remodelled. Now, I know some people lose heart terribly because they feel they can't recapture the alchemy, in a way, of the marvellous rituals they've been to throughout their lives. But I suppose I believe that we're in a transition time. I remember Father Peter Quinn, a great priest friend of mine, a Jesuit from Lavender Bay, talked about the need for much more artistry in post-Vatican II liturgy. And I still think we're in need of that, to capture some of those marvellous moments in a modern idiom. So it's only when we all do invite each other to start thinking in these, to say that is our duty as well, our job. Because I still don't think that the laity has been invited in to that part of proceedings. And until we are, well, it's going to get to the point where we will just have to take that opportunity, of course. There won't be much option. And we'll have to do it together.
Thank you. Anne Atkinson of Richardson writes, Geraldine, I fully support the idea of the church asking the questions and doing the survey. How can we, the church, reach those people who have never known or abandoned the church years ago?
Well, I mean, I think that my view is that the church, you look at societies and you look at the functioning institutions that are there, and the church is one of those. So for all of our demoralisation from time to time and our sense of loss, the church has got masses of life left in it. And I simply believe we mustn't give up on that institution, because as you know, there are those who say, you know, the temple will have to break apart before it is rebuilt. People who become so despairing of real change. Now, I've never taken that view. I've always, and I've said to people who've said that to me, who is going to feed the poor and the lonely and the hungry and visit the prisons? Because a lot of that is undertaken via the church. And I think the church, a revitalised church, will find the answers. In other words, answers come to effective organisations and people. There's that amazing sense of naming the problem. Sometimes when I'm asked to talk, particularly to young women, I say, use the English language properly. So don't come to me and tell me you are stressed. Work out what it is you are. Are you heartbroken? Are you lonely? Are you envious? Are you sad? Are you dishonourable? Are you feeling dishonourable? Have you been honourable? Like, drill down and work it out what it is. It has an immensely liberating capacity. It identifies the problem specifically. Now, I sort of feel we're flailing around in the church in a lot of these areas, and I believe that properly analysed, the church, the answers will come. The Spirit will move us. I actually do believe that. But I still think we're leaving it to others. They can do it in the church, and I suppose that's why I chose the topic.
Thank you. Vivian Arnold, who's a member of our parish, asks, you speak about people's fear of the abyss. Can you comment on the view that God is sometimes to be found in the abyss?
Yes, well, this is a very difficult one, this business of being crushed in order to be found. Look, of course God is to be found in the abyss, but also very dark forces are to be found in the abyss as well. There's a great line by Somerset Maugham, which is pertinent to this. He said, success doesn't wreck people, failure does. And I just don't believe this, that setbacks, multiple setbacks build people. I think anything but. I loathe that type of help that says, you know, if you're on your knees, call on me, I'll be there. Who wants to be as undignified as on their knees and absolutely flat out like a lizard drinking before you actually, you know, call for help? I think that it's short of that where Christ lies and where compassion lies, and that the real charity is observing people heading for the abyss. And I think a lot of people fall into the abyss, and I'm very, very wary of it, to be perfectly honest. I think it takes strong people to survive the caprice often of being left to really fall. And I think in raising children, for instance, I'm astonished at people who still maintain that view that people grow from massive setbacks we're talking about, not just little ones. I don't believe it, actually. So I would be pretty wary of the abyss.
Dennis Granland of Curtin asks, do you think Catholic schools are preparing young people for the pressures of everyday life? And if not, what can they do better?
Oh, gosh. Look, in some ways, I think it is stark and to the great credit of our systems around Australia, that when you go into Catholic schools, there is an exuberance, there is an engagement with life that I think is intoxicating. And the wonderful liturgies and the sense of my daughter, who went through Loreto Kirribilli when she got to university, she said to me, "Mum, I can tell you, I can sit in tutes and I know who's been through a Catholic system and who hasn't." And this was a girl who was distinctly ambivalent about, following up on lots of aspects of her faith, much to my distress. But she was adamant that there was a solid engagement that was vivid. And so I think that sense of living life with intensity, that's another thing over the years I've realised, there's a tremendous appetite in people for a life of intensity. The idea that everybody wants bland safety, it's not true at all, actually. So I think there's an invitation to live. But I do think our Catholic schools, and I think this is really hard, and I know that principals just wrestle with it, this sense of that Alain de Botton, the philosopher, who I think writes about this extremely well, this sort of status anxiety and this meritocratic rise up, which their parents can very much engender. I think the Catholic schools may be just losing that little battle a little bit about that sense that there is something more than the business of rising through life. It is of being of service to others. And I mean, I think the pressures of being free to not opt out, but just to find a place within all of that striving and to be given permission to do that. I believe in that strongly, and I've tried to do that to any young people who cross my path. But you talk to principals and you hear what it's like saying that to a lot of parents these days. So a lot of the parents are the ones who actually need to reconsider that.
Thank you. Tony Abbott's, this is from Brian in Campbell. Tony Abbott has spoken at this forum some years ago and spoke about not wanting to be seen as Captain Catholic. Do you feel that you may be Captain Catholic in the ABC? And is it difficult for Catholics to take a stand within their fields of influence or endeavour?
Yes, it has been, actually. I think that, I mean, it is interesting with people like, because I can remember when Kevin Rudd wanted Compass, when he was in opposition and Tony Abbott was in government, and he persuaded me that we could have a fantastic Compass with Rudd and Abbott wrestling with each other on camera about faith. And Mr. Rudd was extremely excited about this prospect, and he said, no, I'm sure that Tony will be in it. And I said, well, I'm not sure whether he will. Anyway, try though I might, Tony Abbott would not be in that. Now, he might be in it now, and another person may not be in it. But there's no doubt that, look, there's just no denying it that the minute you label yourself as having a belief, there's in the world of news and current affairs, there is a suspicion about you. And you have to decide whether that's going to bother you or not. Now, years ago, I decided it just wasn't going to bother me. I mean, I'd had a long career in news and current affairs. I'd then gone to Radio National with Life Matters, and then Compass came along with this terrific offer, and I thought, yes, I care about that more than most things. I actually have some of the best conversations in my life around that. Of course, I'm going to say yes. It won't take me long at all. But it is a very interesting area that I watch some of our finest journalists actually invite guests on with a religious, who are religious or ordained in one or other faith, and they get up to the point where it starts to get deep, and then they will run away from it, run like a hairy goat away from the question, even though that's clearly the purpose they've invited the person on for. And these are people. It astonishes me how, even though religion is on the front page, you know, every week now, day after day, I could say, but there is still this great wall for many, many people in news and current affairs. And I think you'll find that, oddly enough, a lot of people in the CBDs are much more comfortable. It's quite striking to me in the last 5 to 8 years, and I think there'll be more as this GFC goes on, who are prepared to tell you, be quite blunt and public about the fact that they are involved in their church or they're doing theology degrees or whatever it is. It certainly hasn't hit the media yet. And I remember just one little story. A young woman came to me, a very good woman who'd been trained in news and current affairs, and she'd had her children and she was back to a couple of days a week and she didn't feel she was getting anywhere. And I knew she was really quite a religious person, a very strongly developed faith actually. And she came and talked to me, and I said, she wanted some advice. So I said, well, what do you want to do? And of course, everything she wanted to do was related to religion, one way and the other. Very good religious anthropology questions. And I said, well, why don't you put up a 4-part documentary series, you know, a little radio series, and offer it, and to Radio National, for instance, and get your name up, and you can do that, and you know, because you're very skillful, you can do it at home. And she looked at me and she said, but what do you think the men in news and current affairs will think about that? And I looked at her and I said, does it matter? And I realised it was years since I had even asked that question. But she was still extremely conscious of their views of these choices. Even though I knew they'd be superb, I said, they'll love them. If you want to get back into news and current affairs, do that. So look, I've just come to terms with it now. Just come to terms with it.
Okay, I think on that note, we'll close question time. I'd like to apologise to John and Brendan. We've run out of time for these questions, but I'd like you to join with me in thanking Geraldine for a wonderful presentation tonight.